Even though the president and John Kerry believe this is not East-West, that this is not the Cold War, that's exactly what Putin has treated it as, and why there's been a fundamental misreading of Vladimir Putin, his intentions, and the things that he will do. Didn't we pay attention when Vladimir Putin said the greatest disaster of the 20th century was the dissolution of the Soviet Union?
That was John McCain on Morning Joe in 2014. Warning about what he saw as the Obama administration's lax approach to Russia. Now, as you know, Russia was notably absent from the list of foreign nations and foreign leaders honoring John McCain's record of service. Also staying silent, of course, President Trump, who only referenced McCain's family while posting a picture of himself, even after those aides who were closest to him were actually imploring him to say something nice about John McCain in this statement, but he refused. Andrea Mitchell, John McCain was always tough on Russia, always warned of Vladimir Putin's aggression. Perhaps that's yet another reason why Donald Trump had little use for him.
And the fact that John McCain has been so consistently tough on Putin in a way, frankly, that a lot of his colleagues, the Republican colleagues in the Senate, have not been. There has been so little action to ward off against the ongoing, according to Dan Coats, ongoing Russian interference in our election on, in the cyberspace. The McCain statements after Helsinki also, probably his last statements criticizing Trump foreign policy were after Helsinki, calling it the most disgraceful performance of an American president. That was so pointed, so descriptive, and it was really a touchstone of John McCain to be consistently critical of Donald Trump on foreign policy in a way that Republicans had always been, going back through the Cold War and Ronald Reagan. And it really is quite striking that there is so much waffling on the Russian threat right now.
And Richard Haass, that there was a consistency. He was critical of Barack Obama for not being tough enough on Russia, at times critical of George W. Bush for not being tough enough on Russia. But the only difference between McCain's criticisms then and over the past year was then he was joined by fellow Republican senators who also saw the importance of holding the line against Putin's expansionism. Now, so many of those Republicans grew silent, which is why John McCain's voice was all the more necessary in the age of Trump.
Yeah, in many ways, John McCain represents the main tradition of American foreign policy. And as you were suggesting, what's so worrisome or bizarre, choose whatever word you want, about this moment is the mainstream, in many cases, has been relegated to being outsiders or a minority. But we have, in some ways, what I would describe as the most radical foreign policy of any American president now since Harry Truman. So John McCain was firmly in the Truman, through Reagan, through George Bush, the senior and so forth tradition, very internationalist, supporting allies, working through international institutions, working closest with democratic countries, tough towards Russia, worried slightly about China. And suddenly we have something extraordinarily different. And the fact that it stands out is telling. And one of the worrying things of the last few years, whether it's about foreign policy or anything else, is where is the Congress? This is supposed to be the classroom of American foreign policy, holding hearings, challenging the president when they disagree, reining them in, providing resources where they think is necessary. And all too often, the Congress has been missing in action. John Meacham will know this better than anybody. We used to speak about the imperial presidency, and Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and other historians used to worry about the accumulation or concentration of power in the hands of the presidency when it comes to foreign policy. Well, guess what? We still got it. And if anything, it's stronger than ever, and it's because there weren't enough people like John McCain essentially challenging presidential prerogatives when the president was driving the train off the tracks.
Let's go to the White House now. NBC News Pentagon correspondent Hans Nichols is with us. Also in Washington, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, retired four-star Navy Admiral James Stavridis. He is Chief International Security and Diplomacy Analyst for NBC News and MSNBC, and an operating executive at the Carlyle Group. Hans, let's start with you. Give us the news over the weekend regarding North Korea.
Well, there's an incredible shift on Friday from the president canceling that trip while Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, was planning to head to North Korea. It took a lot of people by surprise. The Pentagon didn't have any advanced warning about it, at least the officials we talked to. So there are big changes going on there. It's uncertain just what's driving this. The president blamed China on trade, but when you talk to and them violating the sanctions, but there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of evidence that China has radically changed their behavior in regards to trade with North Korea. Yeah, there might be some softening along the border with a few truck transfers, but nothing tectonic. You know, Joe, just real quickly on McCain here at the White House, it doesn't appear that they're in mourning any longer. I just checked the flag. It's not at half staff today. The flag here at the White House was lowered yesterday. Today it appears to be still up. Dawn has just broken, so sometimes they lower it, bring it down at night, but not if lights are on it. And you contrast that with the Congress on Capitol Hill, it still is at half staff. So it looks like Senator John McCain only getting a half staff for one day here at the White House. Joe?
Admiral Stavridis, we're past being surprised by anything that Donald Trump does. Let's talk instead about character and John McCain, a fellow Navy man. Before we get into North Korea, give us your thoughts on the life and the legacy of a great man.
Huge loss for the nation, as we've been discussing, but if I may, an enormous loss for the U.S. Navy. Son and grandson of four-star admirals, really part of the naval aristocracy, served so bravely in Vietnam. But what we treasure about John McCain are the memories of him as the rebel with a cause, particularly when he was a midshipman at the Naval Academy. He went over the wall, in other words, went AWOL more than anybody else. He got more demerits than anybody else. He dated more women than anybody else. He was a legend at the Naval Academy, and that legend pulled through to his service, his incredible heroism, as you've talked about so much. You know, if I could put it in terms of a compass, because in the Navy we're always thinking about being at sea, he could look east and west, right? He was someone who could look to the right and the left politically, but he always sailed true north, and we knew that in the Navy. You know what,
Admiral, I wanted to, that reminds me of something that I'm sure you remember, the great Admiral Fetterman. And Admiral Fetterman, after I got elected, he pulled me to the side and was talking about training in naval aviation. And he said, boy, I could use a hell of a lot more PE majors and a hell of a lot less engineers. And it's so interesting. He wanted somebody on the stick that had the instinct, that had the toughness, that wasn't going to always go by the book. And that was John McCain, wasn't it?
It absolutely was. And of course, nobody knows naval aviation better than the congressman from Pensacola, where the fabulous museum is. That's really about right. And John McCain always flew, he sailed true north. And, you know, to the point we were making earlier about Russia, he saw Vladimir Putin so clearly. You'll remember that President Bush met with Vladimir Putin and sort of famously said, hey, I looked in Putin's eyes and I saw his soul, Vladimir's soul. We can work with Vladimir Putin. John McCain was asked, well, you've met with Putin and looked in his eyes. What did you see? And McCain said, I saw three letters, KGB. That's John McCain. And he conveyed that clearly again and again. McCain knew to the last breath he took that Vladimir Putin was no friend to the United States. Why our current president has this blind spot remains a mystery.
Mike Barnicle is with us and has a question about North Korea. Mike.
Admiral, at his core, McCain, despite, you know, we knew what he was ideologically, sometimes right, sometimes middle, but at his core, he was always for the United States of America, clearly and deeply, forever. Today, I'm wondering, what do you think would be on his mind with regard to our relationship after a series of what we were told terrific meetings with North Korea? what would he be thinking today? What do you think?
First of all, I think the president is significantly distracted by domestic events and his own legal struggles, to be honest with you. To the degree he's thinking about North Korea, I think he is hopeful. He's placing a big bet on North Korea coming out his way. But at the end of the day, the fundamentals are bad there, Mike. I think the chances of Kim Jong-un fully, completely, immediately, and verifiably giving up his nuclear weapons are roughly the same chances as the Mexicans paying for the wall under the new president. So I think we're going to require a lot of strategic patience. What I believe is we ought to be redoubling our intelligence efforts, increasing our missile defense, and getting prepared, because I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. And I hope we can land this diplomatically. It's going to require patience out of people like Mike Pompeo. I think he's our best bet, not the President of the United States, in solving that one.
And Admiral, it's Andrea Mitchell here. To that point, we at the State Department were really shocked by what happened last week, because on Thursday, Mike Pompeo, a very deliberate man, as you know, came out with his new special envoy for North Korea, Steve Biegun, and announced him and announced the trip. We had known that this trip was possible, but they formally announced a trip, and he was supposed to have left yesterday for North Korea. It would have been his 4th trip. He had 2 very bad conversations with the North. One trip where he went, the 3rd trip where he went and did not see Kim Jong-un, then at the ASEAN meeting in Singapore. More recently, the North Korean envoy really snubbed him and criticized him right after he'd left. So things have not been going well. But what could have precipitated this Twitter announcement by the president only 24 hours later? Pompeo was having lunch with the president when apparently this tweet went out. So could there have been some intelligence that the North was doing something dramatically different? Or is the president just finally realizing that his grand pronouncements that the nuclear threat is over after Singapore are just so wrong, and he needed a new target, China?
I'm going to bet on door number 2, Andrea.
Okay.
And I think that pretty clearly, as the drumbeat of midterms comes up, what the president is realizing is that he's going to get hammered on his statements that the problem has gone away, because increasingly the intelligence community is correctly telling us that North Korea is simply moving along with their program, no progress. We've really seen this movie before. So I think he's simply trying to take it off the plate of the midterm by saying, we're going to take a little pause here. I still have great respect for Kim Jong-un, really. And that is not going to be a winning strategy. What we need is what Mike Pompeo, and by the way, Steve Biegun is a terrific choice in this role, deep experience in Asia. I think the 2 of them can craft a methodical path that can get us to a diplomatic landing, but simply checking out of the problem abruptly like that doesn't help us. And it is an attempt to sort of throw blame on China, which is being built up to be the scapegoat for the midterms.
Yeah, Admiral, I agree with that China's being built up as a scapegoat, but I think Hans had it exactly right. There's no change in Chinese policy. They like the status quo. They would like there to be an agreement. They don't want a war on the peninsula. They don't want a North Korea with uncontrolled nuclear weapons. And I don't know if Hans is still here. I don't know whether you see any signs, though, that this president and this administration are willing to move away from a kind of, we've got to have complete denuclearization. Yeah. In traditional diplomacy, you would be willing to take some type of interim or halfway measures, or whether they see that as somehow unacceptable. Do you see any signs they would, if you will, have their own version of an Iran agreement with North Korea, or they've trapped themselves and they said it's all or nothing, and therefore they're going to end up with nothing?
Yeah, the only real difference, and maybe Andrea is better suited to speak to this, was that shift on final complete denuclearization, that final versus complete. That was really a slight linguistic shift that you heard from officials at the State Department, namely Mike Pompeo. What we should watch at the Pentagon is if they turn military exercises back on. Right now, it's August. You should have these exercises taking place called Freedom's Guardian. They're not taking place. They're indefinitely suspended. If the Pentagon turns those back on and starts training with the South Koreans in a very public way, then you'll know that things have really shifted at the Pentagon as well. I would just note that the president canceled that meeting in Singapore and then put it back on. That was about a 24-hour pause, where much much longer in this one, which means it could be an indication that it's much more serious. Guys?
All right, NBC's Hans Nichols, thank you so much. Admiral James Stavridis, we've been talking about Pensacola a lot. Did you ever make it through Pensacola?
Only about 1,000 times. But the major event in my life in Pensacola, Joe, was when the Navy sent me down there to see if I would be capable of being a fighter pilot, you know, like Goose and Maverick and Top Gun.
Right.
After about the third time I lost my lunch doing barrel rolls, it was clear I was going to be a destroyer officer and drive ships at sea.
Well, so then you were familiar with Trader John's and the rest of the culture down there. Yeah, which
I will buy you a beer at the Monkey Bar at the museum next time we're both there.
Okay, I look forward to that very soon. Admiral James Stavridis, thank you so much. And still ahead, the money man from the Trump Organization has been granted immunity in the Michael Cohen probe. You know, everybody says, it seems every week, there's a development that's going to be huge. Well, this is very, very significant in the investigation, Robert Mueller's investigation, and in a lot of other investigations as too. We're going to be talking about what that's going to mean for Donald Trump and the investigation. Plus, much more on the life and legacy of John McCain. We're going to be joined by Peggy Noonan, Chris Matthews, and John McCain's former chief of staff and speechwriter, Mark Salter, who, my gosh, knew John McCain more than anybody outside of the senator's immediate family. Also, many, many more guests with us. Morning Joe, we'll be right back.
I spend every day saying to myself, stay calm, stay cool, be passionate, but neither get angry nor personal. And those are two important lessons that I've learned over the years. I spent a lot of time burning bridges early in my political campaign, but political life. Now I work to try to build bridges.
And we'll be watching. Senator John McCain, thanks for joining us and sharing your views.
I haven't had so much fun since my last interrogation.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.